Chapter 551 Auxiliary Techniques by Heidesgrain. 5 days had passed and Jason had utilized every means in order to learn 2 more auxiliary-based techniques. One was a Terra intermediate technique called Concoction Medra that improved his efficiency to concoct huge quantities of potions several times, while simultaneously purifying the mass-produced goods by a large margin. Despite being mass-produced, it was not difficult to concoct with the Concoction Medra technique, let alone to purify every single potion. This would become even easier if Jason were to utilize Solaris. Meanwhile, the second technique he had learned was another Terra advanced technique called Perfect Runes, Volume 1. This was a technique he could simply purchase almost everywhere as long as he was wealthy enough. Even the Olympus Federation should have this technique. Despite that, Jason had been adamant in learning everything through his Emperor eyes, simply because it was much easier to learn the techniques like that, along with the added advantage that it was much cheaper. Jason was generous in the deals he made, making the alchemist and rune master think that he was one of the wealthy prodigies who just wanted to be entertained. Doing nothing but cultivating for several months was boring, and they would receive a request by a curious spectator to allow him or her to observe them during their concoction or rune inscribing process every once in a while. That was because almost everyone learned an auxiliary occupation instead of solely focusing on their combat prowess. The reason behind this mentality was that auxiliary occupations could always become important in dangerous times. Not only the procured knowledge was considered essential, but the ability to forge and repair equipment in dangerous areas held significant importance too. The same applied to concocting several types of potions that were used to heal, replenish energy and other things, or inscribing runes that could protect an entire team during a crisis. It was only inside the broken world that Jason figured out more about the dangers of the world, and that there were more planets ruled by beasts than other intelligent races. At least, that was if he understood everything correctly. Because of the need for resources every race had, they entered areas that were yet to be deprived of the natural resources. These areas were in fact the planets ruled by beasts. Other than that, he heard many things about a planet called Shima, which made him recall the memories Anna had transmitted to him. Unfortunately, Jason was unable to make sense of the information he received about Shima as everyone said different things. According to Anna's information, it was a planet nobody reigned over as it was simply too vast. Meanwhile, others said that it belonged to certain races, only for a third party to counter that beasts reigned Shima. There were only 2 points at which all 3 parties reached a common consensus. Shima had the most precious resources one could wish for. At the same time, it also had the densest and purest cultivation energies one had ever sensed, and in fact, it had all 3 at once. Other than that, there were said to be beings that were able to mix certain energies, mutating them into new types of energy that had devastating capabilities. These mutated energies were mostly the most terrific for the beings that cultivated in them, as their own destruction could occur at any time. It was extremely interesting, but to enter Shima through certain world bridges, it was said that one would have to reach a certain cultivation base that was way above the Ascendian stage. There hadn't been a specific reason for the 3 parties he had acquired information from to believe this theory, but time would allow him to understand everything. Jason was still unable to grasp everything yet because he was still learning and even the Ascendian stage was far away from him. Other than the 3 auxiliary occupations he had learned, Jason had also rented a small room in which he could test the techniques. He forged several perfectly purified ingots, but the first few dozen turned into failures, while the same happened during the concoction and rune inscribing process. Techniques for auxiliary occupations were similar to common techniques, and the higher his proficiency, the better the final results. As such, Jason would have to practice hard, and it was only fortunate that he could make use of Solaris' highly strengthened purification ability, in combination with his high comprehension and the stigma that enhanced the entire process further. Other than those advantages, Jason's most powerful asset, his Emperor eyes, allowed him to find even the tiniest traces of impurities. This was mainly because his Emperor eyes had been strengthened after the primal bloodline awakening in addition to the divine aura he had absorbed. Thus, There were not many problems Jason had to face while forging and concocting the inscription serum of runes. The one thing he lacked was mastery. After he had tested the 3 techniques and gained an acceptable level of proficiency, Jason had exchanged the goods he'd made using the prior stones. It was only after he had finished everything that he returned to the Olympus Federation's part of the broken world in order to cultivate freely. Jason assumed that the other gods' children had also entered the broken world, and he hoped that they would make use of the next 2 months and improve their strength and enable their soul bonds to reach their racial limit before all of them would leave once again. Focusing solely on cultivation was bad, and it was important to adapt according to the need of the hour. Thus, sparring, practicing weaponry and the old technique, or even learning new martial art techniques was the best to do every few months. Before the Liberation Tournament would start, they would have to dedicate enough time to hone their skills in all the above as well. They couldn't simply ignore adjusting their improved cultivation base and be considered as weaklings by their opponents who could take them lightly. Jason was not sure how much the others' combat prowess had improved, but even he couldn't be sure Otto simply fighting every participant of the Liberation Tournament without enough preparations. After having focused on cultivating for 2 months while being inside the broken world, Artemis and Petri's strength was bound to increase by leaps and bounds. That was mostly because of the extraordinary density of mana the broken world had. He had to adapt himself to changes too, and couldn't simply take everything for granted. In the end, Jason had to focus on himself, which was the reason for him to search for a reclusive place where he could cultivate in peace. Summoning Petri and Artemis followed by Solaris, who didn't want to be left alone, Jason accessed his spatial rings before he emptied a huge pile of mana and prior stones on the floor. It's finally time to show everyone how much potential we have, am I right? In response, Artemis screamed out and Petri issued a roar, while Solaris flickered violently. Sitting down, he closed his eyes calmly and focused on absorbing the surrounding mana. His soul bonds were doing the same, and soon enough everyone's stigma began to glow faintly, continuing to brighten up by the second. Their stigmas enhanced each other seemingly like an overlapping loop and merged with the Celestia aura Jason released subconsciously. His aura was slowly growing while his mana absorption rate skyrocketed, reaching a state similar to a few months ago when they had absorbed the divine aura that had been overflowing with mana. Somehow, Jason felt as if everything was slowly starting to become better and that he would fulfill his master's wish soon. While Jason had been able to change mankind's future, rewriting history, he could have never expected what kind of responsibility he would have to shoulder in the future. The human race had been protected from being enslaved, but were the Drake family, the Ephrata, Bahrain and Mylodra race the biggest problem Jason had to face in the near future, or were they just the preliminary steps to something grand, something more terrifying? Unbeknownst to Jason, his short revelation as half-infernal Celestia during the Great Argos War, and his father's intervention had caused more chaos than he could have ever imagined. Chapter 552 Connected Worlds by Hydesgrain. 2 months passed, and before Jason realized it, the entire mountain of mana and prior stones had been drained off. Not even a single stone with primordial energy or mana was left, and they had been wrung dry of every last particle. Because of that, Jason could already hear Artemis' complaints about not having something to eat for the next few days. This caused him to sigh deeply, and Jason knew that he had to earn some money before he could do anything else. He had just finished cultivating, and had to adjust himself to the vast number of mana drops he had liquefied in addition to his soul bond's shared strength that had increased substantially. Petri had started to cultivate with primordial energy, re-refining his entire body that had only been refined by mana before. Thus, he didn't exactly enhance Jason's strength and only enhanced the foundation he already had before. Even then, Jason received a high increase in his physical strength, which was everything that mattered. Meanwhile, Artemis was only slowly becoming stronger, and Jason felt that something weird was going on within her body. She was seemingly storing mana inside her body and intertwining the vast majority with her blood. It was almost as if Artemis was trying out something. Only when she had transmitted the thought that she felt something peculiar about her blood, something that wanted to change, that Jason just nodded his head, accepting everything she said. Artemis was a mutated snowflake owl, and everything about her, right from her existence to the way she had evolved up to now, in addition to the fact that she didn't want to stop but continue to evolve, was a mystery in itself. There were certain things neither of them understood about her mutation, and Artemis had to figure them out on her own. Jason could only tell that Artemis would undergo a metamorphosis soon, as her plumage was slowly turning silver. Maybe she would even evolve into something unheard of, but that was not something Jason could figure out right now. Even though her cultivation base didn't skyrocket, the mana-infused blood increased Artemis' strength drastically. As such, even beasts a rank or two above hers might be defeated by Artemis. Her affinity was also changing, and Jason couldn't help but be proud of his two soul bonds. At the same time, he had just entered the second rank of the lick stage with more than 1,000 drops of liquefied mana. Despite having liquefied more than 100 drops of mana in mere 2 months, Jason was still not satisfied. He knew that his body could have liquefied more, and that mana was the only thing he lacked. Unfortunately, it was not healthy for the body to solely rely on absorbing mana from the stones. Otherwise, he would have just become a frantic blacksmith, forging hundreds or more mana weapons at the lick stage before exchanging them with mana stones to cultivate. Thinking about exchanging goods with mana weapons made him want to return to the Broken World's center. He wished to enter a forging room to quickly purify a few ores to barter them with mana stones. This would also help him quiet down Artemis. At the same time, he thought about Petri, and recalled that his youngest soulbond had already absorbed the mountain of prior stones at the lick stage. Thus, he ignored his previous plan and used the next 2 days to solely earn money. Forging allowed Jason to adjust his body, the strength he used for every single stroke, and the amount of mana he circulated through his mana veins perfectly. At the same time, he could control Solaris exceptionally well, which was helpful to gauge how much his strength had truly increased. After 2 entire days had passed, Jason had exchanged the perfectly purified lick rank ingots he had quickly forged with 2 huge piles of peak lick rank mana and prior stones. Once that was done, he had to quickly leave the Broken World and return to Janor, where he was supposed to gather with the God's Children and the other human powerhouses. It was merely 2 days before New Year's Eve that Jason had arrived in Janor. He had tested his fortified soul conjunction with all 3 of his soul bonds during his journey back to Janor. At the same time, it had been an interesting experience to exert the floating sky movement technique with different movements. The technique could be used with wings and without, which allowed Jason to test out versatile movements he had never used before. Jason had also been playing around with his black flame and the ice affinity while trying to use both in one hand, that resulted in him maintaining different temperatures in addition to his other abilities at the exact same moment. This was something he wanted to test out due to different reasons, and he could only look at the others in an apologetic manner when they reunited. Right now, they weren't wearing the masks anymore because they had officially registered at the Liberation Tournament. Other than that, the God's Children, Merle, and the other human powerhouses had been designated as the human race's embassy that had been welcomed by Janor's city lord. Jason was glad that he hadn't been present at that time. His only desire was to be left alone so that he could think about certain things while practicing his weaponry before the Liberation Tournament began, and nothing else. His mind was at a completely different place, oblivious to the Liberation Tournament that had been the topmost priority to Jason before. However, after he had left the Broken World, this had changed, because there was something else that had distracted him, something that may be interesting under normal circumstances if it were not extremely dangerous. When he had emerged from the Broken World, he had encountered the talkative guard once again. Yet, instead of ignoring him, Jason felt like he should listen to the green-winged man. What he heard was astonishing, and led Jason to change his trajectory. He had left the continent with the strongest pace he could achieve, only to land on a small island in the middle of the ocean, without anything but a single, gigantic, newly emerged world bridge. The world bridge was what the green feathered guard had told him about. Normally, a new permanent world bridge wouldn't be worth mentioning to anyone, but the one Jason was looking at was definitely worth being mentioned. While others found only one fact about it interesting and at the same time somewhat frightening, his emperor eyes detected multiple interesting yet also confusing factors. What everyone could perceive were the world bridge's fluctuations and their stability, meaning that it was a permanent world bridge. However, the more important factor was that the permanent world bridge had lower restrictions than any other world bridge Jason had ever seen before. The second threshold of the Prisma stage. It was a permanent world bridge that allowed beings at the second threshold of the Prisma stage to enter and leave Argos unhindered. This was shocking, and would have caused a mass panic in the Olympus Federation, let alone on Khaniir and the archipelago. However, the more astonishing thing was that there had yet to emerge a single being from the other side. This could indicate that the area at which the counterpart of the world bridge in front of Jason had emerged, was located somewhere in a desolate area that had no living being for miles on end. Because of that, nobody seemed to be alarmed until now, and it was impossible for anyone on Argos to properly destroy the naturally generated world bridge either way. Their strength had to reach at least that of the restriction, if possible above, in order to accomplish such a feat after all. Despite the thoughts others had, Jason was unable to forget what his emperor eyes had seen. Even several days later, when he had reunited with the others, he couldn't help but think about the world bridge that had not only naturally generated on Argos and the other planet, but also that the world bridge would lead him to the world Argos had previously rejected by all means. It was the world that had forced several world bridges that brought forth hordes of beasts to Argos. The exact same world Jason had already seen several temporary world bridges earlier before the bridges had disintegrated and vanished into thin air. Jason had assumed that he had solved all problems by annexing and devouring his father's divine aura, but had this really changed anything? In the end, Jason and his father's existence on Argos had caused a tremendous chain reaction that could have likely ushered a prosperous era for the entire planet or its doom. However, what Jason didn't know was that this time it was not his fault for something to happen, because it was the other, unknown planet that had to face fateful changes. Is Argos and that other planet connected? But why and how? Chapter 553 Fusion by Hydesgrain. The only reason for Jason to stay calm was that there had yet to emerge a terrifying beast at the second threshold of the Prisma stage from the other side. If that were to occur, he couldn't even be sure what would happen to the entire planet. There were 3 overlords with the exact same cultivation base on Argos, but who could say whether the emerging beast had manifested only one rotating crystal or more? In the end, there would only be a total of 3 rotating crystals at the second threshold of the Prisma stage, and every single one of them indicated a tremendous difference in one's combat prowess. A single beast could be enough to defeat all 3 overlords as easily as they had ended the entire Great Argos War, without any effort. This would certainly be devastating, but as long as nothing emerged from the said world bridge, Jason decided to not mind it. Even if he thought about it, what was there for him to do? He was too weak to defeat beings at the Prisma stage's second threshold, let alone destroy the naturally generated world bridge. Jason was not even sure if that would be useful, or destroy even more. Thankfully, the incidents about the temporary world bridges that had appeared out of nowhere, only to spit out thousands of beasts before the world bridge disappeared once again, didn't occur again. As such, Jason decided that this problem was solved. Now, the next priority would be to win the Liberation Tournament before giving his best to foster a connection between mankind and the Olympus Federation slowly. It was not necessary for them to merge, let alone love each other out of a sudden, but a simple peace treaty and a basic understanding of and respect towards each other was all that he hoped for. That was everything Jason wanted. After that, he would rescue the Fleurs before hopefully leaving Argos behind. There might be people he would miss, but he had decided that Argos was not the place for him to stay. In the end, the universe was vast and there were too many things he had yet to figure out. One of them was to meet his father at least once and search for his maternal grandparents. Jason couldn't be certain that they were still alive, but somehow, he felt like they were still alive, and doing well. Until now his gut feeling had hardly been wrong, thus he believed in it this time as well. As such, he had to figure out where they had disappeared to. Because of that, he had a total of 3 priorities. Those priorities were, to win the Liberation Tournament to procure the Lesser Origin Flame, to save the Fleurs by overwriting their soul contract after figuring out how to do so, and last but not least to investigate what had truly happened to his mother and grandparents. It was a priority list correlated to the time they should be completed. The last point was something the Heaven's Eyes sect patriarch could achieve because Jason knew that Nathan had lied to him before. In the end, as long as nothing happened to the newly emerged permanent rift, Jason's priority list would remain the same. With only 2 days left before New Year's Eve, Jason didn't even think about slacking off. Instead, he wanted to fight against the other gods' children who had increased the total strength by around 200 drops of liquefied mana. This was mostly because they had been able to cultivate unhindered while their soul bonds continued to advance. By allowing the strongest soul bond to enter their mana core, the advancement would be even greater. As such, there was no need for them to be worried about their cultivation base. Rather, they had to further improve their combat experience, martial art proficiency, and so on. This was something they had already started since their return to Janor, which was more than a week before Jason had finally returned. Thus, only when Jason had been back did they finally start to fight him seriously. While trying to improve, he wanted to pressurize himself. Because of that, he had asked 2 gods' children to attack him at once while also telling them to utilize their fortified soul conjunction. Due to this, Jason had been unable to overwhelm them, even if he gave his best in terms of brute force. Instead, he allowed Artemis to enter his mana core while trying out several new combat styles he had thought about. While residing inside his mana core, Artemis could control his flow of mana to a certain extent. At the same time, she could insert her own mana inside Jason's mana flow without hurting his veins. This was something that hadn't worked before and would have proved detrimental to his body under normal circumstances. They hadn't realized any of that while fighting against the 2 gods' children, and Jason could only feel that his body was becoming lighter by the second, while his blood felt more vigorous than ever. Because of that, he and Artemis could utilize the ice affinity within him at the same time, conjuring several hundred ice spears at once. Controlling the ice affinity had become second nature to Jason, as if he had been born with it. While fighting against the 2 gods' children who pressured him, making it impossible for Jason to retaliate and counterattack, he couldn't help but smile brightly. The longer the fight took, the less pressure Jason felt, and the upper hand they had was slowly changing in his favor. His fight caused a huge commotion in the small arena they had been assigned by the City Lord to train or rest until the Liberation Tournament would start. Not only the human powerhouses averted their attention from the other fighting gods' children to him, but even the other battles suddenly came to a halt as a huge, unknown pressure radiated from Jason. It was similar to his Celestia aura, but also something that did not belong to the Celestia bloodline. It was similarly oppressive but wilder and more dangerous. What the hell is that? Is that really Jason? Ben suddenly exclaimed, and the others could only nod, without knowing what was going on. Jason hadn't even noticed that he was being looked at weirdly. He and Artemis had only been excited to fight, to use their soul bond connection that was extremely firm and glimmering brightly. Unbeknownst to him, a second stigma had manifested above the reversed wing stigma and glowed faintly. It did not belong to Jason, and was only a manifestation that would soon disappear. However, Even more shocking was that Jason's hair was slowly turning white silver while two black bulges protruded out of his head. Artemis' wings had already manifested on his back, and it looked like Jason and Artemis were slowly fusing together. Time passed slowly, and Jason's appearance didn't change any further than Artemis' black horns protruding out of his forehead. The two gods' children he had fought were overwhelmed by Jason's strength that had increased with the seconds, and it was only when they slumped to the ground, overwhelmed by Jason, that the fight had ended. Only a moment later, Jason's oppressive aura was slowly receding, and exhaustion began to overwhelm him as he returned Byakuya inside the soul world. It was only then that Jason noticed the other gazes that were trained on him. "What's wrong?" This question broke the ice, and Merlarth could only take a deep breath to calm his mind, thinking that Jason was a halfling and that he would be nothing but abnormal, an anomaly. "Look at the hair on your arms and then touch your forehead." Confused by what Merl meant, Jason simply followed the instructions, only to widen his eyes in astonishment. "My hair is white silverish." Only then did he touch his forehead. Feeling restless, he took out one of the perfectly purified ingots he had still inside his spatial ring. They were polished enough to see his reflection, which caused Jason to exclaim, "What the hell happened to me?" Not sure what exactly his current state was, he had to ask Artemis. However, at that moment, he noticed that Artemis' eyes were closed and that a single thread connected Artemis and the mana core she had occupied. Jason was not worried because he felt that Artemis was still fine, but it made him uncomfortable to see her in a state he knew nothing about. As such, he disregarded everything as he severed his connection between his mana core and her. This could have damaged his mana core, had his gut feeling not told him that it was nothing worrisome. The moment he had severed the thin thread, Artemis' wings, horns, and stigma dispersed while his hair returned to its previous black color. In the end, even after several minutes had passed, and Artemis had awoken, Jason couldn't figure out a proper reason for what had happened to occur, while Artemis had only said that she had felt a deeper connection to him. Even if that was better than knowing nothing, it was weird, and the others next to him were as oblivious as Jason. It was only when Betty made an assumption that was meant to be a joke that Jason couldn't help but look at her in shock. "Maybe you're fusing with your beast." Ha ha ha. Chapter 554. So It's Like This by Hydesgrain. If the fortified soul conjunction allows you to manifest your soul bond's body parts, why shouldn't a fusion be possible? Jason was just blurting out things, while Betty looked at him in confusion. "I was just joking." However, Jason couldn't even hear her anymore as his mind had already secluded itself, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The sensation of the fusion had been unique and his entire aura had changed due to Artemis' influence. Exactly the same could be said about his demeanor and combat style during the fight against the two gods' children. Why did I suddenly merge with Artemis? Did something change about our connection, or did an external factor allow this? Jason was not sure what exactly it was, but his strength had increased tremendously after merging with Artemis. The fusion was definitely something special, and worth researching. He would have done it if he just had enough time. Figuring it out right off the bat was not possible, and the only thing Jason knew was that both he and Artemis had wanted to become stronger, to defeat their opponents that had somehow culminated into the temporary fusion. Because there was still some time left before the Liberation Tournament would start, he thought that it was best to continue practicing fighting techniques. Artemis occupied his mana core, thereby increasing his strength, and the sparrings began once again after everyone had calmed down. Jason knew that the others wanted to hear an explanation from him, but he was unable to give them one. As such, he told them the truth before a misunderstanding would occur. Taking one last glance inside his soul world, he compared the three fortified soul conjunctions with each other. His attention returned back to the two gods' children who had decided to use all their strength instead of holding back. Initially, they didn't want to harm Jason because they were already fighting 2 against 1, but that was not something they could pay attention to anymore. Otherwise, they would only embarrass themselves by showing how weak they were. Seeing the determination in the two gods' children, Jason couldn't help but smile brightly. It had been a long time since he had felt so free, without any burdens weighing him down. The first spa had already allowed him to release his tension, however, it was only now that he decided to not bother about the new ability he and Artemis seemed to have obtained. Rather, Jason wanted to focus on the fight in front of him. Artemis felt the same, and with the exact same mindset, they were about to join the fight when, without a prior warning, something inside the soul world changed. Both Jason and Artemis didn't realize it, but Petri and Solaris felt that Artemis' soul connection, that was by far the strongest, began to gleam lightly. It was becoming firmer and slowly changed its color into that of Artemis' plumage, mixed with the stigma's colors. Petri and Solaris immediately notified Jason about the same, momentarily distracting him from what was happening in front of him. The gods' children appeared in front of him a moment later, while Artemis' soul connection was reverting back to its normal state. This information was also immediately relayed to Jason, who could only lament about his soulbond's impatience while trying to shift his focus back on facing two fully empowered attacks of his friends. Gritting his teeth, Jason realized that they weren't holding back anymore. Under normal circumstances, Jason would have been happy about this, but unfortunately, his distraction had caused him to miss the perfect timing, let alone unintentionally merge with Artemis once again. Thus, he had to unleash his entire Celestia aura, his stigma, while exerting the floating sky movement technique to the highest proficiency he was currently able to execute. At the same time, he slashed out with Byakur, which he was holding with one hand while lifting his other hand that held a highly compressed, explosive black fireball. His moves were lightning fast due to the floating sky movement technique that was further enhanced by the sheer mass of mana that circulated through his body, followed by the Celestia aura and stigma that were slowly merging with each other. Nevertheless, the force he could release with one arm was not enough to fend off the god's child called Tom. Tom's cultivation base was at the 5th lick stage but was physically enhanced to the 8th lick stage. Additionally, the fortified soul conjunction boosted his strength that was comparable to an average cultivator at the peak of the 9th lick stage. With Artemis occupying his mana core, Jason's physical strength had reached the mid of the 8th lick stage, but even such a devastating strength was unable to overcome Tom's dominating physique. Byakur collided with Tom's warhammer but was pushed back without any resistance, only for Jason to resort to Petri's curses that he hadn't planned on using before. By utilizing the race-specific weakening curse that was immediately followed by the petrification curse, Jason regained the upper hand. He had been too focused on Tom, and only now was he forced to revert his attention to Xenia, his second opponent from the God's Children. She focused on using her elemental affinities and a spear with a cultivation base that was also at the 5th lick stage. Her physical enhancement was weaker, but she was also at par with a normal cultivator at the 8th lick stage. Contrary to Tom, her mana core was further amplified by her soul bonds, which allowed her to unleash a devastating amount of mana at once. Unfortunately, she had to fight Jason, who had just thrown the small, highly compressed ball of fire towards her. Knowing that she had to evade it, her attack was forcefully halted. Despite that, Xenia could continue to advance once the ball of fire brushed past her. Jason saw this, and a smile emerged on his face as the faint image of a black flame could be seen inside his bright golden silverish eyes. The highly compressed black ball of fire exploded, unleashing its might of a flame comparable to the peak of the 10th lick stage. Because of the explosion that occurred right behind her, she was pushed forward, missing Jason with her spear by a hair's breadth, and fell on the ground. At that moment, Artemis circulated her mana towards Jason, only to utilize it in order to envelop Xenia in a tight ice cage. This gave Jason more than enough time to turn his head towards Tom, who had lifted one of his hands from his weapon in an attempt to punch Jason. Unfortunately, he was a quarter of a second too slow because Jason was already moving. Suddenly, he and Artemis sensed the same feeling as before, overwhelming them as the desire to defeat both Xenia and Tom ignited within them. As their wavelengths matched and they were consumed by a single goal, they slowly merged as a faint thread loosened itself from Jason's mana core. Artemis accepted it willingly, and Jason received an image from both Solaris and Petri similar to what he had received before. His soul connection with Artemis was transforming once again, but this time, he had expected it. Jason was not astonished or distracted by it. Instead, his mind digested everything at once as a radiant smile appeared on his lips. So, that's how it works. Chapter 555 New Year Banquet by Hydesgrain. While his hair turned white silverish, black horns protruded out of his forehead and Artemis wings sprouted out of his back. They unfolded at once, revealing a magnificent wingspan of more than 15 meters. Only a moment later, Artemis' stigma manifested above Jason's, as his entire demeanor changed once again. The increasing pressure and Jason's laser focus coupled with his bright smile had been a sign, telling Tom that something was going on, but the poor youth couldn't understand it. Meanwhile, Xenia was only overwhelmed by the sheer pressure Jason's aura released after she broke out of the ice cage. The Celestia aura that had merged with the stigma's bright glow was transformed by Artemis' influence, allowing Jason to feel a sudden surge of adrenaline that swept through his body. His entire being had turned more ferocious, but the merging process seemed to be cleaner than it had been before. It didn't take Jason and Artemis long to merge together, and the main reason was that both weren't rejecting each other. Jason's physical strength didn't increase directly, but the mana-intertwined blood that Artemis seemed to combine with him, reinforced every single move he did with mana. This strengthened him and allowed Jason to overwhelm Tom, who had barely overcome the petrification that had forced him to halt in his tracks for a quarter of a second. Only the race-specific weakening curse lingered on him, weakening and preventing him from beating Jason in a physical fight. At that moment Tom's eyes turned red as he activated one of his Soulbond's inherited abilities, enlarging his body. Yet, before anything could happen, Jason's surroundings turned ice cold as he pushed away Tom's free arm to grasp his neck. Coldness spread through Tom and everything seemed to slow down. Kicking out, Jason hit Tom's hand that was holding the war axe, which allowed Jason to use his now free arm to slash at him with Biocore. With that, he defeated Tom before he could even make use of his trump card, as Jason had already ducked and leaned back. Several dozen thunderbolts shot past him, only to hit Tom, who was flung away. At that moment, Jason used Artemis' wings to push himself up from the ground his back had almost touched a moment ago. Xenia was still able to fight, but once she made eye contact with Jason, who had smoothly evaded her surprise attack and jumped back on his feet in the blink of an eye, her will to fight was crushed. Jason's eyes looked extremely scary right now, and the aura emanating from him was not the seemingly kind and simple Celestia aura but something wild, telling Xenia that he wouldn't hold back anymore. Even Merle and the other powerhouses couldn't help but grow alarmed and were ready to intervene any moment. However, contrary to everyone's expectations, no such thing happened. Jason, who had realized that Xenia had given up, simply retracted his aura, while Artemis remained merged with him. This was unexpected, but both he and Artemis were currently feeling and acting as one being, meaning that both had no intention to continue fighting. When the fight ended with his victory, Jason couldn't help but inspect his body more intently. There were no feathers growing out of him, and only his hair had turned white silverish. Other than that, the aura he had unleashed and Artemis' stigma seemed to be the only things that were different from a normal fortified soul conjunction. At least, that was what one could perceive from the outside. Jason felt everything to be different and better on the inside, and it was as if he could exert even more strength. At that moment, he released Solaris Black Flame Affinity because he felt as if his connection with the flame wanted to tell him something. Weirdly enough, it was exactly as he had expected. As he looked at the black flame that had golden strands within, faint blue cobweb-like strands spread through the flame. The heat it gave off was not searing hot that would increase the training hall's temperature, on the contrary, it was ice cold. That's interesting. Jason just mumbled, looking at the ice-cold flame that had been transmuted because he had merged with Artemis. The others were just looking at Jason as if he was insane to accept the sudden change so easily while testing out all kinds of things without bothering to wait before the fight had truly ended. He had just retracted his aura the moment Xenia had revealed that her will to fight had dispersed. Jason had sensed this immediately, which was something the others didn't know, and it was only when she stored her spear inside her spatial ring that everyone noticed that the fight had ended. After having been able to merge with Artemis 2 times, many things were clearer than before. As such, the last 2 days before the Liberation Tournament passed in the blink of an eye. Everyone had given the best to reach the highest possible combat prowess during the last 2 days and set aside New Year's Eve to recuperate. The tournament would start in the afternoon, and there was more than enough time to let the shallow injuries the God's children and Jason had sustained heal. They were excited about the Liberation Tournament, and they had somehow forgotten the real reason for them to come to the Olympus Federation. Jason noticed this too, and he couldn't help but feel that this was not a bad way to enter the Liberation Tournament. If they gave their best without thinking about the responsibility they had been entrusted with, it would be much better than always worrying about embarrassing themselves and the entire human race. Earlier, Jason hadn't expected that the God's children would be able to increase their combat experience and proficiency with their martial art techniques in such a short time, but they were extremely talented and had proved him wrong. This caused him to wonder what the human race's fate would be if they could leave Argos and enter other planets with more mana. Were they only an ordinary race, or was the human race comparable to higher-ranked races? Even if someone's potential was bad in both soul awakening and control over mana, they could bind strong monsters to their soul world as long as their vessel was strong enough and they had accumulated enough soul energy units despite taking longer than usual. Because of that, Jason found that the human race's overall potential was at least at par with higher races and that their biggest restriction was none other than Argos. With that thought in mind, Jason was sure that the human race had an interesting future in front of them, as long as they weren't destroyed by others who feared their talent. Now that New Year's Eve was upon them, the human race's embassy couldn't spend it alone. They had to follow their responsibilities too. In order to establish ties with the Olympus Federation, they had to meet the senior authorities and get to know each other. In the end, members of the human race embassy had different opinions on how exactly these ties should look like. Some only wanted to be on friendly terms with the Olympus Federations, while others wanted to merge with them. Meanwhile, the majority just wanted to have a peace treaty with trading agreements, which was something Jason supported. As such, with a goal in front of them, they had to attend the Olympus Federation's annual New Year's banquet. How could Jason have known that he would be degraded to become nothing but a mere translator, the moment they would arrive in front of a large mansion? Chapter 556 Liberation Tournament by Hydesgrain. The mansion was filled with higher-ups of the Olympus Federation and their children who were extremely talented according to their own beliefs. However, Jason couldn't even focus on anyone with his emperor eyes because the human powerhouses, including Merlaths, had turned him into an unofficial interpreter and were asking him to translate everything to help them converse with the foreign races. That's why I told you guys to learn the universal language. He shouted inwardly, only to glare at Merle, who was laughing after Jason had translated what the dragon youth in front of them had said. Taking a deep breath, Jason realized that he had to give his best to help mankind to strengthen ties with the Olympus Federation, and the best way to do so was to help them communicate with each other well. It was annoying to translate, but he could de-escalate situations by conveying the proper message instead of allowing Merle or the others to use their broken universal language skills to say something they didn't mean. Jason had not even realized that a few hours had passed in which he had acted as an interpreter and helped the human embassy members interact with all kinds of higher-ups of the Olympus Federations by negating the language barrier. This was looked at weirdly by the foreign races that clearly understood the meaning of Jason's faintly glowing stigma and the aura radiating from him. He had also heard many groups gossiping about him because seeing him mediate conversations between two different races had made them curious about him. Unfortunately, it was difficult to approach him at the moment because he was acting as the human race's interpreter. It was important to make a good first impression on the other races, and he couldn't neglect the responsibility. Only somewhat later did a middle-aged Dragonute arrive who was surprisingly able to converse in the human language quite well. The man was able to speak in several dozen languages because learning them was his interest and the hobby that allowed him to relax the most. To Jason's surprise, the old man offered to take over Jason's role, which the human embassy accepted. Despite that, Jason remained with his group in order to see whether the Dragonute was doing his job well or not. Fortunately, that was the case, and seeing him free of his temporary interpreter duties emboldened others to try to approach him, trying to figure out who he was and why he was with the human race. Even though his appearance was that of a human, the stigma and aura said otherwise. As such, some races assumed that Jason belonged to some sort of a grand, or superior race that was able to transform into different life forms. Less than an hour after the Dragonute had replaced him as an interpreter, Jason had been surrounded by a few higher-ups of the Olympus race who tried to approach him with ulterior motives. It was uncomfortable, and Jason tried to find a way out without coming across as rude. His eyes lit up when he spotted a group of young men and women from different types of races. He separated from his old group and approached the alien he had gotten to know during his last battle in the Colosseum, Jared. Through his Emperor eyes, Jason knew that Jared had gotten the hang of efficiently utilizing his Thunder Constitution with one seal unlocked. This was great and allowed him to exert much more strength, while Jason could only hope that the next fight would become much more exciting than their last. While walking towards Jared, Jason passed by the Olympian group from the Colosseum, but they didn't seem to remember him. Jason had been surprised a little, only to remember that nobody should have been able to imprint his mana fluctuations into their mind, let alone see his face, as he had worn a mask inside the Colosseum the entire time. Thus, he released some mana into his eyes while lifting his hand to envelop it in black flames for a second. Jared, who had fought against Jason for the longest duration amongst all other opponents, had already assumed the young man in front of them to be the Silver Dragon masked man. It was simply too obvious. He knew that the man behind the Silver Dragon mask had been a human due to several factors, while Jason's golden silverish eyes, aura, and stigma had been extremely familiar to Jared. As such, the black flames had only been the last hint that had caused Jared to be certain about his assumption. Because of that, he couldn't help but smile lightly. They didn't know each other very well, but both felt as if they were acquaintances, almost like friends, owing to the fight they had in the Colosseum. Understanding each other's mindset and the fact that neither liked holding back was enough to make two prodigies respect each other. This was something only true competitors could understand in the face of rivals that were worthy of each other's attention. Thus, they shared a bond of understanding between them. When Jason reached the group, he introduced himself once again before they started to talk with each other. Knowing that Jared could have easily deciphered who he was, exposing his identity as the Silver Dragon masked man was nothing he should be cautious about. Even if everyone were to know his identity, it wouldn't make a difference because he had grown a lot, as almost 3 months had passed since his winning streak of 50 at the Colosseum. Other than the Olympians, there were more prodigies who were as talented as Jared, but none of them caught Jason's interest. Since not only his individual strength but that of his soul bonds had increased as well, Jason knew that his physical strength was exceptional as long as Petri occupied his mana core. His youngest soul bond might have only been at the 5th flick stage, but he had cultivated in the path of primordial energy. Because of that, one couldn't underestimate the 100% amplification of a beast at the 5th flick stage as it increased his physical strength drastically, adding to Jason's already powerful physique. In the end, even those at the 9th flick stage would be wary of his physical appearance. The New Year's Eve banquet was wrapped up not long after Jason had encountered Jared, and they had mostly spoken about the Liberation Tournament that was about to start in a few hours. Through that, Jason got to know the most commonly used structure of the tournament with a few tips that only a few knew about. Furthermore, Jared and the other Olympians who thought highly of Jason's combat prowess had praised many talented prodigies who had barely made the cut that allowed them to participate in the Liberation Tournament. They were almost too old but had managed to tick all the boxes while being as talented as Jared. As such, it was obvious how strong they were, and only Jared's unique constitution made the young Olympian even more talented than the others, whom barely a few had known until 3 months ago. Apparently, the strongest participants had the combat prowess that barely reached the Prisma stage, and even that was already said to be exaggerated. However, instead of thinking that the rumors were exaggerated, Jason took them at face value. It was not unlikely for a few individuals to have reached a high cultivation base as long as they had been provided with enough resources along with the broken world as an environment to cultivate in. However, their cultivation base was probably not everything because one required exceptional combat prowess that was based on great martial art techniques with high proficiency, high combat experience, and the possibility of possessing unique traits in addition to inborn talent to fight while being pressured. Jason, for example, could advance while being under tremendous pressure. It helped his brain to process information and arrive at decisions at a rapid pace, breaking through tricky situations while certain abilities might even improve under the pressure that would normally weigh him down. Thus, Jason looked forward to fight against opponents who were said to be as strong as an average individual at the Prisma stage, and the few hours before the Liberation Tournament started passed quickly. Chapter 557 Brute Force by Hydesgrain. It was afternoon when Jason entered the Colosseum in which the Liberation Tournament would be held. The interior had been transformed a little bit and was now equipped with a raised podium which allowed more spectators to watch the tournament. Meanwhile, the combat rings inside the Colosseum had been reorganized with a specific mechanism. Because of that, there was more than enough space for several thousand participants to stay inside the Colosseum's arena section at once. Unfortunately, the wide area still fell short to fit in every participant. In the end, there had been tens of million applications of confident citizens of the Olympus Federation, but only 100,000 had been accepted to participate. There were certain requirements one had to fulfill to participate in the tournament that were tweaked after every single battle. With the consistent increase of mana Argos generated naturally, the newer generations were bound to become stronger than the older ones. That was if one disregarded one's attitude towards cultivation and the provided talent. As such, only the individuals who were evidently talented in one or multiple aspects, owners of special traits, or known for their role model-like attitude towards certain situations had been accepted. Despite that 100,000 participants were still too much, which didn't even include the descendants of higher-ups, or the human embassy. Owing to the large number of participants, the first 2 tournament rounds were known as the Decimator rounds, in which the true talents were separated from those who were unable to hold a candle to the others. The exams changed for every Liberation Tournament, but most true talents were confident in their overall strength. Thanks to this, they could calmly listen to the newly appointed Olympus Federation's representative, who was in fact also the manager of the Colosseum. The Dragonute Jason had already seen an image of, floating in the air, right in the center of the Colosseum. He hovered at a height where he could be visible to everyone and amplified his voice before he began his short introductory speech. Hello dear participants, citizens of the Olympus Federation, and our esteemed guests from the human race, it's that time again, the Liberation Tournament has finally returned, and we can celebrate 10 years of having survived the Great Calamity. We survived dark times, overcame the obstacles that had been thrown into our ways, and found shelter on this infant phase planet. Some may be dissatisfied, and we are fully aware of this, but staying alive is the most important factor in order to achieve the following goals, am I right? As a matter of fact, we have invited new friends to participate in the Liberation Tournament with us to prevent a repetition of past incidents. The human race has been attacked by other ordinary and even higher races, but we have also suffered due to them. They had been arrogant and disregarded us, but we couldn't do much against them, in fear that they might return with stronger forces once the world bridges were to become stabler. As such, we will have to build one strong force on Argos and come up with a solution. In order to achieve this, befriending the human race is the easiest solution. By now, everyone should have heard about the rumors that they have gained the ability to bind beasts and use their strength, and even inherit their affinities. Either way, back to the main topic, without further ado, I would like to introduce the first round of the Liberation Tournament. After saying this, the Dragon Youth paused to take a deep breath. He then took out a large machine that looked similar to a punching arcade machine in addition to an orb Jason and the other gods' children were already familiar with. Understanding the rules was not difficult, thus Jason didn't intend to listen to the Dragon Youth's next words. Rather, he felt a complex mix of emotions surging up within him as he repeated the Dragon Youth's words inside his head and understood the true meaning behind them. They invited us, not to test how weak we were, but how strong our most powerful soul awakenings truly are. That's unexpected. Jason assumed that the Olympus Federation was aware of how strong the human race was on average. As such, it was obvious that mankind's cultivation base was lower in comparison to the Olympus Federation that had many connections to procure cultivation resources in addition to a great place to nurture their most talented youths. Thus, the only plausible answer Jason could come up with his current intel was that the Olympus Federation was gauging whether the strongest humans of the youngest generation were valuable enough to consider the whole race as a potential alliance partner. Not sure what to make of it, Jason couldn't help but think that it was both good and bad at the same time. The gods' children heard what Jason said, but had been distracted because they had to listen intently to the Olympus Federation's representative who was currently explaining everything about the first round and what one had to pay attention to in the universal language. After that, he demonstrated everything so that even those who were unable to understand him earlier, got what had been said, which was evidently in favor of the gods' children. While Jason was deep in thoughts, more than 100 punching machines were placed in a row on either side of the arena. Several meters in front of them, a mana mastery orb had been placed with thousands of intertwined threads that were knotted together at countless intervals. However, what astonished Jason was that he could see through the mana mastery orb, which allowed him to see them before anyone else. Through this, he could tell that all mana mastery orbs had been calibrated with the exact same difficulty. This may be interesting under normal circumstances, but Jason hadn't known that his Emperor eyes had already advanced so much. Since when can I see through mana mastery orbs? Scratching the back of his head, he decided to revert his attention to the other participants who had already gone towards the open field, queuing up to show their might, mana mastery, which included mana perception, sensitivity, accurate control, and so on. The difficulty could be said to be on a high level as the mana mastery orb was already tricky. However, the punching machine's requirement to advance was nothing in comparison. At least, Jason didn't think highly of the requirement they had to meet in order to advance to the next round. As a participant, one had only to punch the punching machine with a single hit whose force would equal to 2 ranks above one's cultivation base. That being said, one could use all means to increase their combat prowess because there were no restrictions. Because of that, using one's trump card, certain martial art techniques that accumulated one's strength, mana, or affinity at one singular point to explosively release it, or other means to increase their strength temporarily was more than enough. In Jason's opinion, everyone with a decent body refinement manual that has been trained to the peak of one's cultivation base should be able to have learned how to control their strength. Furthermore, their strength should have increased too, allowing them to exhibit more combat prowess than their cultivation base revealed. Using a common Terra intermediate martial art technique would already be more than enough to cross the gap of 2 ranks. How could Jason have known that the combination of the Mana Mastery Orb and the punching machine was more lethal than any other Decimator round of the Liberation Tournament ever was? For the God's Children, the punching machine was literally child's play, but for others, it was more dangerous than one could expect. The pressure weighing on every participant was extreme, and a single mistake in either of the first 2 tasks meant that one wouldn't be able to advance to the second round, thereby disqualifying one from the possibility of winning a lesser origin flame. As everyone had practiced and toiled for years to build up their foundation and trumps for the Liberation Tournament, it was essentially different from how the God's Children saw the tasks. They were only worried about the Mana Mastery Orb, but Jason managed to calm them down. He didn't tell them anything about the orbs, but simply said that they were just like the ones mankind used, only with a higher difficulty calibrated. This was logical, but enough to calm down the 5 God's Children who waited for half an hour before it was their turn. The results of those who had been tested before had been rather disappointing to look at. The majority failed the Mana Mastery Orb task, without even meeting the lowest required threshold, and a large part of the minority failed miserably in the second task. Those who had already entered the 9th Lick stage didn't have to reach the combat prowess at the Prisma stage, and an increase in their punch's strength equal to 2,000 drops of liquefied mana was more than enough. In the end, Jason was mildly interested in others' physical strength, only to find out that some individuals he had assumed to pass with flying colors were holding back, trying to fulfill the promise they had made to their families. This promise was to hold back and only reveal their hidden trumps and secret techniques once it was necessary. They had been unnecessarily proud and confident about their innate strength. This resulted in a lousy performance, and they embarrassed themselves and their family by failing in the first round. Only those who had realized that the first round of the Liberation Tournament was not to be taken lightly had been really able to pass the test. The others failed miserably, despite some of them having the necessary strength to cross the punching machine's threshold. In the end, it didn't really matter what the others did as long as he and the God's Children gave their best without holding back too much. Once the God's Children's turn was over, it would be his batch's turn to be tested, and Jason could only hope that everyone would pass the first round. Their mana perception should be good enough, at least if I were to consider their affinity control. Chapter 558 Decimator Rounds by Hydesgrain. Fortunately, the God's Children lived up to Jason's expectations as they met the basic requirements of the Mana Mastery Orbs exam without any issues. This caused him to sigh in relief as he watched them punch the punching machine. They used their raw strength without utilizing a martial art technique, let alone taking a soul bond into their mana core to strengthen themselves further. Despite using no affinity or mana, their punch still met the required strength, and the first of the Decimator rounds ended without an issue for them. As such, everything went according to plan, and the spectators, who had observed the God's Children performance with keen eyes, clearly understood that the strength they had displayed was nothing but brute force. Thus everyone began to slowly understand why the human race was seemingly more interesting than previously expected. Their real strength had yet to be explored, but it was obvious that their soul world was profound. Not long after the God's Children had advanced to the second round, the others in the same batch had finished their exam too. As such, it was finally Jason's turn. He was not worried at all and went towards the set of Mana Mastery Orb and punching machine he had been assigned to. Because there was someone he found interesting in his batch, Jason wanted to finish the round quickly. He wished to take a look at a young woman's Mana Mastery talent and strength. She belonged to a sub-race of those that were called demi-humans, named Tigran. She was half human and half tiger, which was interesting to look at because Jason had heard many stories about demi-humans. He had wanted to meet one of them before, as they were said to be able to morph between their human and animal appearance. This gave them many advantages, but at the same time, they were frowned upon because of this. The female Tigran, Jason found so interesting, was at the 9th lick stage and had a light affinity. As such, the moment his exam started, Jason utilized the information he had received from his Emperor eyes to quickly unknot the intertwined and tangled mana threads inside Mana Mastery Orb. His mana fluctuations pierced into the orb, finishing everything in a matter of half a minute, as a droplet of sweat trickled down his forehead before he approached the punching machine. Without holding back, he used his brute strength to cross the required threshold easily before turning towards the woman. Jason knew that he had wasted too much time with the Mana Mastery Orb, but he couldn't help himself because he had almost completely untangled the mana threads in the orb before. Unfortunately, this was the reason he couldn't see the light affinity awakened Tigran anymore. He could only see her punching bag with the number 11,500 written on it, meaning that her punch had the force of someone at the peak of the 10th lick stage with some extra strength. Even though Jason didn't know whether the Tigran had used her whole strength, he couldn't help but smile. She will be interesting to fight against, he thought before walking out of the arena towards his friends, unbothered by the result of his exam. Jason was confident enough to pass the first round despite not having refined his body for a long time, thus he simply returned to the God's children, who gave him a cheeky smile. Executing the strength of an average being at the mid of the 7th lick stage while being at the low 2nd lick stage is not holding back, you know, Betty commented, teasing Jason. Ignoring her remark, he just turned around to see the number of liquefied mana drops his quick punch was worth. 6,451 drops. I guess that's not so bad, he muttered with a faint smile, knowing that this was not the only trick up his sleeve. He had yet to use an affinity, martial art technique, let alone his fortified soul conjunctions, or the newfound fusion to increase his strength. Other than that, Jason had many more ways to increase his strength, or even to distract and decrease his opponent's strength. The God's children knew this, and couldn't help but involuntarily rub their arms and abdomen while trying to cover up the painful memories that had resurfaced with a forced smile. Even though they were confident in their own strength, Jason was on a completely different level. He might be from a different race, but that didn't matter to them as they wanted to be as strong as other races, which included Jason's mysterious Celestia bloodline. In comparison to everyone else, Jason was the most talented and powerful because despite just being 18, he was already stronger than the majority of the population on Argos. Nevertheless, he helped them to improve and remained humble, if one were to leave out how nonchalantly he did certain things that others required double or more time to do. This was frowned upon by the God's children, and they had to let go of their jealousy to prevent themselves from turning too greedy or petty. The spectators looked at Jason's score with astonishment, finding it hard to believe that he was only at the low 2nd lick stage. Maybe he is using an extremely strong body refinement manual. According to the stigma he has and everything else, his origin shouldn't be the human race, but his mana fluctuations are partially the same as that of the human race. It was the voice of the manager of the Colosseum who was speaking with a few higher authorities who were seated next to him, looking towards the Colosseum with a glint of interest in their eyes. I guess that he is the halfling the Shadow Walkers had been talking about 2 years ago. That being said, he is a human to some extent, but even if he has a soul world, his physical strength is extremely high, so his body should be refined to a high degree, that's certain. There were many rumors about the human race, and one of them had been the existence of a halfling. The Olympus Federation had ignored this rumor because it was deemed as impossible. It had mainly originated from the Shadow Walkers that had swept through the Federation without showing a tinge of respect towards the Federation. However, from the looks of it, the rumors might as well be true. What kind of race could this young man belong to? His aura seems familiar and is profound, but I just can't think of the race it belongs to. Unbeknownst to Jason, his Celestia aura had already been altered several times. The first time it had been because he had accepted both his human and Celestia race's heritage, while the second time had been when he had almost turned into an infernal Celestia. Fortunately, the anger, wrath, and agony had been cleansed from his mind at that time, altering his aura for the third time. Meanwhile, the fourth time had been after he'd annexed his father's divine aura, bringing it closer to the Celestia aura once again. It was only because of his altered aura that nobody was able to figure out which race he hailed from, but that was exactly his great advantage. At the same time, the higher-up's assumption about his strength was only partially true, as only the physical strength equal to 31 mana drops hailed from his body refinement. In comparison to the strength his punch had exerted, this was nothing, and Jason knew that his current body refinement manual was unable to cope with the efficiency his cultivation speed had. This meant that he could increase his strength faster by absorbing mana instead of refining his physique. This rendered the Netherworld's fort technique useless for Jason. Chapter 559 Oppressive by Hydesgrain. From the initial 100,000 participants who had been accepted to take part in the Liberation Tournament because of their strength, unique traits and other advantages that made them more powerful than others, only 10,000 were barely able to pass the exam. Those who were tested after the first few batches realized that the difficulty level of the exam was something they should take seriously. Thus, they concentrated on breaking through the basic requirements of the exam, only to witness that the human race's embassy members had passed everything without any issues. Jason had even completely solved the Mana Mastery Orb exam task and executed a simple punch worth several times his cultivation base. After digesting this, nobody dared to hold back and utilized every single trump they had. Instead, paying attention to the first round and passing the exam had become the most important task to keep their family's reputation and glory intact. Once that was done, they would think about what the next round of the Liberation Tournament would bring. During the last Liberation Tournament, the number of participants who advanced through both the Decimator rounds had been 10,000, but now that number barely made it to the second Decimator round. As such, it was evident how high the difficulty level was. At the same time, Jason could clearly tell that the number of real prodigies was much higher than he had initially expected. Even if the second round would decimate the number of participants by another 90%, the remaining 1,000 participants would be the cream of the crop on the whole planet. This was definitely interesting, and what Jason found even better was that the majority of participants had a high cultivation base or the capabilities to surpass the strength of several ranks. Thus, he looked forward to the next round and those that would follow suit. When the second round started, the arena was cleared of the punching machines and Mana Mastery Orbs. While the spectators were gossiping about who could possibly win the Liberation Tournament, an enormous rune emerged on the ground of the arena as several dozen pillars shot out of the ground. It happened silently, but the more time passed, the more spectators noticed the change of the arena's interior. An individual at the Prisma stage with his hand on top of the pillar stood behind each of them. A batch of high-ranked mana stones at the Prisma stage surrounded the higher-ups who released strong currents. Jason knew that the Olympus Federation was more versatile with runes and mechanics, but he hadn't expected to see a gigantic magic circle appearing out of nowhere. His Emperor eyes hadn't noticed anything, which meant that either it had just been engraved, or that it had been carefully sealed somewhere to prevent releasing even a single trace of mana as it was doing now. To Jason, this felt similar to the time he had encountered the untraceable drakes, as they had been able to hide from him despite his eyes' great ability to perceive mana. This was intriguing, and he couldn't help but insert more mana into his Emperor eyes before he scanned every small detail of the magic circle. The magic circle was multi-layered with all kinds of large runes that connected with each other in the first layer, only for the smaller runes in the second layer to be put tightly above, slowly intertwining with each other. Like that, an extremely complex magic circle had been constructed, connecting every single rune with each other. If even a single rune is wrongly inscribed, nothing works, but they're also amplifying each other, and the mana consumption to activate the multitude of different difficulties shouldn't be too high. Jason was still not exactly sure what the next task would be, but he still turned towards his friends and warned them. His voice was not low, and the others around them heard him telling the God's children what they were supposed to do. Thus, one young man from the Claria race couldn't help but chuckle, which was frowned upon by the other participants. What? Can't I even laugh when I see something funny? Even though this human's aura is unique, his strength is still barely at par with those at the 7th lick stage. Isn't it funny that he is giving tips to those who are stronger than him? This bulky human's punch was at the 10th lick stage. When Jason heard this, he couldn't help but smile, while looking at Tom. You wanted to brag with your punch, huh? The Claria behind you is trying to embarrass me because I am giving you tips. He had to speak with the God's children in the human language, thus nobody was able to hear his exact words and only heard him say something. Jason found this language barrier quite interesting because it allowed him to play around a little bit. Ignoring the provocative taunts of the young Claria who was at the 7th lick stage, Jason continued explaining a few things he had perceived to the others. In the end, the Claria had to give up, as not only Jason but also everyone else began to ignore him. His complaint had been useless, and inappropriate because everyone who had seen Jason's punch at the punching machine knew that he hadn't used anything but his physical strength. It was only when Jared appeared behind the young Claria out of a sudden that the atmosphere tensed up. On behalf of Jason, Jared commented with an overly cheerful smile. In your favor, I hope that the Liberation Tournament will prevent intentional crippling or killing, otherwise, you might either end up bedridden or buried under the ground. Hearing Jared made the young Claria frown as he looked at Jared in confusion. Olympian Jared. Do you want to say that this clown is stronger than I am? Jared had passed by the oblivious Claria after speaking his mind when his next words made Jared halt in his steps for a moment. Stronger. It's already quite ignorant of you to believe that you even have a chance against him. Dream on, kiddo. After that, he walked towards Jason, leaving the baffled Claria alone. Jason noticed this, but instead of saying anything, he simply nodded his head at Jared. The preparations for the second round were soon finished and the participants were ordered to enter the magic circle. Less than half an hour later, every single participant was standing inside the magic circle. It was a little bit crowded, but nobody said anything as they waited for the Olympus Federation's representative to announce the rules of the second round. However, contrary to everyone's expectations, the rules were quite simple. For the second round, the only task is to stay inside the magic circle. Attacking each other is forbidden, and only those that can remain on their feet after 30 minutes will advance to the next round. A word of caution from my side: the longer you stay inside the magic circle, the more difficult it will become. Good luck. Exactly when the representative had said, good luck, the higher-ups that stood behind the pillars released their mana, inserting it inside the pillars that began to glow in a faint blue light. Once every pillar had begun to glow, the magic circle was slowly activating, enveloping everyone in a faint hue. Just a moment later, Jason mumbled, "Attention," as he realized what exactly the magic circle's purpose was. Tremendous pressure weighed down on everybody, forcing a few participants to their knees, while the vast majority of other participants paled at once. At that moment, a faint smile emerged on Jason's face as everyone around him was forced to reveal what they had tried to hide: the extent of their willpower and determination to win the Liberation Tournament. Chapter 560, Seal by Hydesgrain. Jason stood calmly in the center of the magic circle, looking at the God's children who had begun to sweat buckets due to the tremendous pressure weighing down on them. Almost everyone seemed to be having the same issue, and there were already a few who had collapsed barely a few moments after the magic circle had been activated. Meanwhile, Jason was enveloped by his Celestia aura, while his eyes were glowing faintly. He was still feeling some of the pressure, but it didn't really affect him. Furthermore, Jason knew that he could completely diffuse the pressure if he were to unleash and enhance his stigma by merging it with his Celestia aura. At the same time, it was possible for him to insert more mana into his Emperor eyes that were likely to diffuse the pressure that weighed on his mind. Apparently, the magic circle was releasing pressure in 3 different ways. First, it attacked the body, then the mind, and last but not least the mana core and mana veins. Jason's Emperor eyes prevented his mind from being influenced by most external factors as long as he inserted enough mana into them. At the same time, the Celestia aura and his stigma completely fended off the pressure on everything that had to do with mana as it instinctively protected his mana core and mana veins. The same applied to his soul world that seemed to have been targeted by the mind-boggling pressure but was perfectly shielded as well. Barely some of the oppression managed to touch his physique, though it had failed to penetrate his defense and affect even a single cell inside his body. Jason's body had already been refined by the divine aura that had released a tremendous pressure that was much more distinct and scarier. Time passed slowly, and Jason looked around, sizing up his competitors and gauging who was likely to pass the second round and turn into his opponent in the combat rounds that would likely follow. As such, he had lots of things to do, while trying to assess whether there were hidden races he hadn't seen or encountered in Janor before. Claria, Dragonutes, Ilians, and a total of 4 demi-humans, Tigrans, Hamar, Fyrmn, and Liza. Jason was just mumbling the names of all the races he saw in front of him while walking through the crowd seemingly unaffected. There were several participants that were holding the ground like Jason, but they couldn't move as freely as he did. Earlier, Jason didn't want to encounter other races he had never seen before because it would force him to adjust his combat style to the specific trait they had, but now this had changed. Despite his opponents revealing tremendous strength, Jason felt as if he was holding himself back. Something hindered him from advancing further and he had yet to figure out what exactly it was. When he had fused with Artemis, this sensation had temporarily dissipated, but Jason was still unable to comprehend what exactly it was that had happened. The fusion process seemed easy, but it was more complex than one could have imagined. Every cell inside his body was slowly merging with Artemis in the fusion process, and it had only been possible for them to achieve this because their soul bond was extraordinarily strong. However, that was not everything, as Jason's body had slowly been altered by his soul bond's influence, which was in fact the amplification he had received. This was extremely interesting, and one could say that humans with dozens of soul bonds would lose the traits that made them human over time. Initially, this had only been a theory made by a professor called James Gray, who had lived in Asterix inside a small C-grade city for his entire life until the Great Argos War had begun. However, this theory had been proven partially correct, as the DNA tests of thousands of citizens reflected small evolutionary changes that occurred over time. Because Jason had known James Gray, he had read through his publications from time to time. The fusion process was one of the possible theories put forward by Professor Gray after studying the relationship between humans and their soul bonds, along with a fortified soul conjunction that had been established long back. And this was a theory he had released years ago. There were several other theories, but most of them were uninteresting to Jason because they named advantageous or disadvantageous factors that came with the change of the human's DNA. It was possible for the entire human race to be slowly torn apart, and be rendered unable to procreate with other humans if the genetic model underwent a drastic transformation. However, what Jason could only perceive from such theories was an exaggeration. Since the Mana Awakening, it was obvious that mutations could prevent one from procreating with others, and the last 3 centuries since mankind had found out about the soul worlds, nothing had changed. Furthermore, being unable to procreate with the human race was probably one sign of these particular individuals being able to procreate with other races. The very same reason made him assume that his mother's Emperor eyes were the reason why she had been able to give birth to a halfling, aka Jason. This was only a theory he had made up in his head, but Jason didn't think that it was unlikely. But even then, his existence should have been a miracle, because a woman belonging to a race that had yet to be even considered a common race had been able to give birth to a Celestia race halfling. His father was a divine being like every other Celestia, and Jason was not sure how the human side of his bloodline had been able to stay dominant against the influential and extremely powerful Celestia bloodline. What Jason didn't know was that his entire Celestia bloodline had been sealed even before he had been born, just to allow his body to stay intact, and enter Argos without tearing the world bridges and the planet itself apart. However, even more interesting was that it was not his father who had sealed his bloodline, but something that even his father was afraid of. His father had been oblivious to Jason's existence until years ago, so there was no way he could have done it. It was something Celestia Yaldra was unaware of. A being had wanted to protect Mina and her unborn child, that is Jason, in return for having been saved, tended to, and protected by a mere mortal being. And that is how the being had returned the favor, by sealing Jason's bloodline. If Jason were to know any of that, everything about his existence would make more sense, yet, turning everything he knew about his mother and grandparents upside down. Their tale hadn't ended with Argos, but it had only begun, and Jason had yet to find out anything really important about his family. Oblivious to his true lineage, Jason was roaming through the magic circle that had become less crowded with more and more participants collapsing on the ground. Despite that, there were a few of them who used their entire willpower to push themselves and overcome their limits. They were trying hard to turn the obstacles they had to face into an opportunity to become even stronger by strengthening their mind and body. At the same time, the pressure allowed some particular participants who had intentionally not used any technique to diffuse the oppression to comprehend something important. When Jason noticed this, he couldn't help but feel intrigued as he understood what they were trying. Should I also? Why not?